Listen up, because I'm about to tell you about a cartoon that was so dark, so terrifying, that angry parents literally forced it off the air. I'm talking about Inhumanoids, the evil that lies within. A show that featured a 40-foot undead monster who could turn people into zombies with a single touch, and another creature with a transparent stomach so you could watch victims dissolve in acid. Yeah, this aired during Saturday morning cartoons in 1986. But here's the thing. This wasn't some accident. This was Hasbro and Sunbow Entertainment deliberately pushing the boundaries of what kids could handle, and it almost worked. Almost. So in this video, I'm going to reveal the full story of how Inhumanoids went from being one of the most innovative and terrifying cartoons of the 80s to a forgotten franchise trapped in legal hell. We're talking about the insane behind-the-scenes decisions that made this show so dark, the Unproduced Season 2 that would have introduced the devil as a character, and why this show, despite being ahead of its time, never stood a chance. But first, let me give you some context, because Inhumanoids wasn't just dark for the sake of being dark. This was a calculated risk by one of the biggest toy companies in the world, and understanding why they made it will blow your mind. The Sunbow Hasbro machine. Alright, so let's set the stage. It's 1986. Hasbro is absolutely dominating the toy aisle. They've got Transformers, they've got G.I. Joe, and they've figured out the perfect formula. Make a cartoon that's basically a 22-minute commercial for your action figures. But here's where it gets interesting. Hasbro partnered with Sunbow Entertainment and Marvel Productions to create this content machine. And they brought in Toei Animation from Japan, the same studio that did Dragon Ball, to handle the actual animation. Hasbro designed the toys and provided funding. Sunbow, though, handled creative direction. Marvel Productions developed the narratives. And Toei brought this incredible technical sophistication with fluid animation and heavy shadow work that made Inhumanoids look unlike anything else on American TV. Now, most companies would just keep doing what works. But someone at Hasbro had a wild idea. What if we made a show that was basically Lovecraft for kids? And I'm not exaggerating. The creative pitch was literally, what if H.P. Lovecraft had written Marvel Comics? Instead of heroes fighting bad guys, they wanted to focus on ancient, cosmic-scale monsters. These primordial entities that had been imprisoned underground for millennia. The good guys? They weren't soldiers or space robots. They were geologists. Scientists in high-tech exosuits trying to stop the apocalypse. The team was called Earth Core, and they had names like Herc Armstrong, Derek Bright, and Edward Augutter. And here's the kicker. Hasbro made a decision that was completely backwards from everything else they were doing. Instead of marketing the heroes, they decided to market the monsters. The subtitle of the show was literally, The Evil That Lies Within. They were telling parents, hey, your kids are going to love the bad guys in this one. That's like if G.I. Joe was called Cobra, the terrorist organization you'll root for. It was bold, risky, and kind of brilliant. But it also meant they were swimming against the current of how every other successful toy line worked. The show didn't even start as a standalone series. It debuted as part of the Super Sunday anthology block, which also featured Jim and the Holograms, Bigfoot and the Muscle Machines, and robotics. These were 6 to 7 minute segments designed to test the waters. Jim became the breakout hit, but Inhumanoids showed enough promise that they expanded it into a full 13-episode season, the horror show nobody asked for. So let's talk about what made this show so disturbing, because we need to understand just how far they pushed it. The main villain was this creature called Decompose. Now, Decompose wasn't just a monster. He was an undead colossus. Picture a 40-foot-tall, rotting corpse with exposed ribs and internal organs. And his power? He could touch you and turn you into a 50-foot skeletal zombie. Not implied, not off-screen. They showed this happening. There's this character, Sandra Shore, who gets transformed into this monstrous skeletal thing, and people who watched this as kids say they still can't get that image out of their heads. The transformation wasn't quick either. You saw the flesh decay, the bones emerge. It was body horror in a kid's cartoon. But wait, it gets worse. Decompose's ribcage functioned as an actual cage. He would stuff humans inside his chest cavity, right next to his rotting organs. Can you imagine pitching that in a boardroom? So the toy will have a ribcage that opens up, and kids can put the human figures inside, and somehow that got approved. Then there's Gargoyle, this cyclopean monster with a transparent stomach. And I mean transparent. You could see the remains of victims being slowly digested by acid in a cartoon for children in 1986. The other main villains were equally terrifying. Metlar was this massive creature made of molten rock and magma. Tendril was this predatory plant monster that could regenerate and spread like a virus. These weren't your typical cartoon villains with goofy schemes. These were existential threats. The voice acting added to the horror too. Chris Latta, the guy who voiced Cobra Commander and Starscream, did the voices for both Decompose and Tendril. And apparently, this dude had barbed wire for vocal cords. He could scream and howl for hours without losing his voice. Neil Ross, who voiced Herc Armstrong, said Latta's performance was genuinely unsettling to record. The show also had this heavy shadow aesthetic from Toei Animation. Everything felt oppressive and claustrophobic. They used split-screen techniques and cinematic camera angles that were way ahead of their time. This wasn't bright, colorful Saturday morning fare. This was dark. And the violence wasn't cartoonish. There's a scene where Dr. Herman Manglar falls into a vat of toxic waste that literally dissolves him to the bone. Then, Decompose uses his necromancy powers to reanimate the skeleton into this creature called Nightcrawler. They showed a human body being liquefied on screen. That's something you'd expect from a horror movie, not a toy commercial. The Hasbroverse nobody talks about. Now here's something that's going to blow your mind if you grew up with these shows. Inhumanoids takes place in the same universe as Transformers, G.I. Joe, and Jem and the Holograms. I'm serious. This was a proto-cinematic universe decades before Marvel made it cool. The connection? A character named Hector Ramirez. He's this investigative reporter who hosts a TV news program called 20 Questions, and he shows up across multiple Sunbow shows. In Inhumanoids, there's an episode called Cult of Darkness, where Ramirez infiltrates an underground cult and discovers it's a recruiting scheme for Blackthorn Shore and the Inhumanoids, and he witnesses Decompose turning teenagers into zombies on camera. There are other connections too. The October Guard, this Soviet military unit, appears in both G.I. Joe and Transformers. And in Inhumanoids, there are episodes featuring Soviet characters, including Colonel Anatoly Kiev, codenamed Tankmaster, who eventually defects to join the Earth Corps. In Transformers, there's a character named Marissa Fairborn, who's explicitly identified as the daughter of Flint and Lady J from G.I. Joe. And then there's Old Snake in Transformers, who is clearly meant to be Cobra Commander. So Sunbow and Marvel Productions were building this interconnected world, and Inhumanoids was part of it. But because the show failed commercially, that corner of the universe just disappeared. It's like if the MCU had a movie that bombed so hard, they just pretended it never existed. The parents revolted. So you're probably wondering, how did this show even make it to air? And the answer is, barely. The controversy started almost immediately. Parents were furious. We're talking legions of angry parents calling TV networks and Hasbro to complain about the monstrous amputations and writhing deaths by toxic waste. The Nightcrawler transformation scene became the poster child for the backlash. But it wasn't just that one scene. The entire show had this atmosphere of dread and genuine danger that parents found inappropriate. Kids were having nightmares. Parents were writing letters. TV stations were getting complaints. Media critics said the show was trying to push boundaries, not just with gore, but with adult themes and psychological terror. The show had this cynical view of authority. The heroes were constantly fighting against politicians who didn't believe the threat was real. There were disaffected teens being recruited into cults. The villain Blackthorn Shore was motivated by greed and forbidden knowledge. It was bleak. One critic said the show would never have a snowball's chance in hell of being produced under modern standards. And honestly, they're probably right. But here's what's interesting. The show wasn't trying to be gratuitously violent. The creators genuinely believed they were making sophisticated storytelling that respected the intelligence of their young audience. They wanted to show that actions had consequences, that danger was real, and that heroes had to make difficult choices. The show also dealt with themes of environmental destruction, with the Inhumanoids representing the consequences of humanity's exploitation of the Earth. Blackthorn Shore's industrial greed literally unleashed hell from beneath the surface. That's pretty heavy stuff for a Saturday morning cartoon. But here's the thing. Controversy alone doesn't kill a show. What killed Inhumanoids was that the toys didn't sell. First, the competition was brutal. 1986 was the year of Thundercats and Jace and the Wheeled Warriors. These were shows with traditional heroic narratives that were easier for kids to digest. The toy market was also reaching saturation. There were too many toy lines competing for the same dollars. Second, the toys themselves had a problem. Transformers had this built-in play pattern. You get an action figure and a vehicle in one. Battle Beasts had figures that doubled as game pieces. But Inhumanoids? The toys were just toys. No transformation gimmick, no dual purpose. And here's the real killer. The scale was all wrong. The three main monsters, Mettler, Decompose, and Tendril, were massive 14-inch figures. That made them expensive to produce and expensive to buy. The Earthcore figures were standard 3.75-inch size, but to get the full play experience, you needed the giant monsters. That's a high barrier to entry for parents. Plus, the whole line was villain-centric. Kids wanted to play as the heroes, but the marketing was all about the monsters. Hasbro had bet that kids would want to collect the terrifying villains. But in practice, most kids wanted to be Herc Armstrong fighting the monsters, not playing as Decompose. There was also a planned Evil Scientists subline that would have included human-sized villains like Blackthorn Shore and Nightcrawler, but the line was canceled before Series 2 could reach shelves. By 1987, Hasbro was facing declining profits across multiple toy lines. They made the difficult decision to cancel several shows, including Gem and Inhumanoids, to focus on their core, profitable brands. The writing was on the wall. The Season 2 that never was. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Because Inhumanoids didn't just get canceled, it got canceled right before things were about to get even darker. Showrunner Flint Dill has confirmed in interviews that he has scripts for a planned second season just sitting around his house. Think about that. There are actual scripts for episodes we'll never see. And according to toy designers like Dave McDonald, Season 2 was going to introduce a character explicitly called the Devil. I'm not making this up. They were going to have the Devil as a character. He was designed as one of the evil scientist figures and apparently looked like the creature from John Carpenter's The Thing. McDonald said things were set to get pretty dark in the third series of figures. There were also prototypes for other characters that never made it to shelves. Nightcrawler Unmasked, showing an even more grotesque skeletal face. Brain Man, a cyborg ally who transformed from cyborg to stone. Slither, a reptile monster who spit electric blasts. And Gagoil, who appeared in the show but whose toy was never widely released. The fact that Hasbro was prepared to double down on the horror suggests they thought they could make it work. They had invested in character designs, prototypes, and scripts. This was a full production pipeline that got shut down. Imagine what could have been. A second season that pushed even further into horror territory, introducing literal devils and expanding the mythology. But the sales numbers told a different story, and Hasbro pulled the plug. So why haven't we seen a reboot or revival? Why isn't Inhumanoids on streaming? The answer is a legal nightmare that's kept the franchise in limbo for decades. First, there's a naming conflict with Marvel's Inhumans. Since Hasbro produces Marvel toys, they reportedly believe that marketing something called Inhumanoids alongside Inhumans would cause brand confusion. And since Marvel Productions co-produced the original show, the ownership is incredibly messy. But here's the really wild part. Hasbro let the trademark rights lapse. They just forgot to renew them. There's this story from the late 2000s where writer Aubrey Sitterson was working on G.I. Joe comics for IDW Publishing. He got approval from Hasbro to bring the Inhumanoids into the comics. He wrote outlines, got everything approved, and then mid-production, Hasbro told him he couldn't use the characters. Why? Because they'd let the trademark rights expire. So Sitterson had to completely rewrite his story. He ended up using kaiju-sized versions of the Fatal Fluffies, these weird creatures from an old G.I. Joe episode. It was a mess. This incident really highlighted how little priority Hasbro has given to the brand. It's just been sitting there, legally complicated and commercially forgotten. There have been attempts to bring it back, though. In 2011, Hasbro introduced a project called Unit E, which was supposed to be a shared universe with Mask, Micronauts, and a renamed Inhumanoids called Primordia. The premise was that the monsters were rising from the earth to punish humanity for environmental abuse. Artist Matt Frank was involved, and they promoted it at comic conventions. But it never progressed beyond the concept stage. More recently, the license for Transformers and G.I. Joe moved to Skybound Entertainment, the company behind The Walking Dead. They're building something called the Energon Universe, and there have been rumors of an animated streaming series potentially launching in 2025. This has led fans to speculate whether Inhumanoids could finally receive a modern reimagining. Skybound has shown they're not afraid of dark, mature content, so they might be the perfect home for it. But as of now, it's just speculation. The rights issues remain complicated. It's frustrating because the potential is there. In an era where we're getting reboots of everything, where dark animated content is thriving on streaming platforms, Inhumanoids could find its audience. The original show was ahead of its time. Maybe now is finally the right time. So here's the thing about Inhumanoids. It wasn't a failure because it was bad. It failed because it was too ambitious. Hasbro tried to merge cinematic horror with the Saturday morning cartoon model, and the market just wasn't ready for it. The toy line needed a transformation gimmick it didn't have. The content was too dark for mainstream audiences and too expensive for parents' wallets. The legal landscape eventually swallowed the brand whole. But the unknown facts we've uncovered, the unproduced Season 2 scripts featuring the Devil, the detailed prototypes that never made it to shelves, the intricate Hasbroverse connections, reveal a franchise that was far more sophisticated than its short run would suggest. For those of us who grew up watching Mettler rise from the Earth's core, or seeing Decompose transform victims into skeletal horrors, or witnessing the Earth core battle against impossible odds, Inhumanoids remains the definitive example of 80s weird horror for kids. It was a show that dared to be different, that treated its young audience like they could handle something genuinely scary and complex. The show had depth that most toy commercials didn't even attempt. The Earth core weren't just generic heroes. They had personalities and specializations. Herc Armstrong was rough around the edges, but a natural leader. The villains had real motivations. Blackthorn Shore was driven by greed and forbidden knowledge. The Inhumanoids themselves were forces of nature, representing primal chaos. And maybe that's why it still has a cult following today. Because sometimes, the things that fail commercially are the things that succeed artistically. Inhumanoids was a show that pushed boundaries, took risks, and refused to talk down to its audience. The tragedy is that we'll never see those Season 2 scripts brought to life. We'll never know what the Devil would have looked like in full animation. We'll never see Slither battle the Earth core. But for those 13 episodes and that brief moment in 1986, Inhumanoids showed us what Saturday morning cartoons could be when creators were willing to take risks. It showed us that kids could handle complex storytelling, genuine scares, and moral ambiguity. And even though it failed commercially, even though it's trapped in legal limbo, even though most people have forgotten it ever existed, for those of us who remember, it remains a testament to the power of ambitious, uncompromising storytelling. That's the real legacy of Inhumanoids. Not the toys that didn't sell, not the controversy that got it canceled, but the proof that sometimes the most memorable stories are the ones that dare to be different. It was a show that, like the monsters it depicted, continues to lie within the collective memory of a generation, waiting for the right moment to be unearthed once again.